Hello and welcome to the Big Ideas Thought Leader series, which allows you to engage with some of Australia's most influential leaders across a range of industries. My name is Sam Clark and I'll be the facilitator for this webinar. Today's webinar gives you the opportunity to hear from Fiona Nixon, the Head of Corporate Affairs at Bank Australia. Fiona's presentation today is titled Upholding Your Values. In her presentation, Fiona will share her experience with Bank Australia to help you discover how to succeed in corporate affairs, PR, and marketing while staying true to your organisational values. Before we begin the webinar, let's spend a minute talking about how the software works and how the webinar will run. You should be able to see a control panel on the right of your screen. The control panel should let you know that your microphones are muted, and down the bottom has a chat function for you to type questions. All participants will remain on mute throughout Fiona's presentation. You're more than welcome to ask Fiona a question at any time. Just type your question into the chat box, and following Fiona's presentation, I'll read out all the questions for her to answer. I'd now like to introduce Fiona Nixon. Fiona Nixon has a wealth of knowledge, having spent more than 20 years working in communications, community engagement, and marketing for large and small organisations. Her passion for communication comes from the ability to tell stories and change the way people see the world. This passion has led her to Bank Australia as they strive to provide Australians with a real banking alternative that challenges the way that people see banks. I'm happy to introduce Fiona. Fiona, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sam, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining in today. I thought I would spend a few minutes talking about three main things that I've learnt over the time doing corporate affairs and communications work. And I'll use Bank Australia, I guess, just as an example of these three different lessons. Perhaps I'll just start off though by talking a little bit about, well, I guess the dark side of corporate affairs and communications. I think we've all heard the terms like spin doctors and, you know, merchants of untruth and those kinds of comments being made about particularly sort of public relations, and that there can be a perception that communications people just come in and, you know, either sort of gloss things over or make them sound really good when they're not really that good, all the way through to, you know, trying to put words around issues that are just plain wrong. So in many ways, public relations has a bit of a reputation issue, and certainly early in my career, I saw that in action and was put in a position where I was asked to do things or to create messages that I wasn't all that comfortable with. Thankfully, I don't know that that happens a lot in lots of organisations, but there are some things that I'll share with you today. There's three things that I wanted to share with you today that is really about if you're thinking about how you communicate your ideas and your organisations. These three things can help you, I guess, stay aligned with your own values as a person and as a professional. But also, if you're working in an organisation that does have some really good values, how you actually align your communications and your marketing with the values of that organisation. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is purpose. And a lot of people, there has been a lot of talk about purpose in business media, in, you know, certainly a lot of emerging social enterprises are talking about purpose. And it's really fantastic because there is this growing consciousness that businesses need to have a purpose beyond simply just profit making. There's a fabulous TED talk by Simon Sinek, whose quote I've got here on the slide. And he makes a fantastic argument that people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And the why is really why you're in business, what's your purpose, what are you actually there for? Knowing your purpose is absolutely critical for communications, because when you know your purpose, then you can really start to talk to people in a way that also, I guess, in a way that resonates with their own beliefs about their own purpose and their own values. So it sounds like a sort of a soft concept, but one of the world's largest accounting firms, EY, have done a whole lot of research recently into how purpose and how businesses that define, understand, and then communicate their purpose are starting to achieve better results than those who don't. So there's some dot points there about, you know, what purpose is, and it is really about a business thinking about, yes, so I might be a business that is a bank. So I provide accounts to people, I provide loans to people, but really what is it underneath that? And what else do we want to try and achieve as a bank? And I'll talk a little bit about Bank Australia's purpose in a moment. But I guess that the reason why purpose is important for communication is that, and there's a second point there, it does actually galvanise people to ignite long-term positive change, and it can also really drive people to growth and to innovation. The other really important thing about purpose is that a lot of the research, not just EY's, is showing that consumers are really expecting companies to do more than just what they do. They're expecting them to make a contribution to communities or to the environment and those types of things. So the first thing is really about knowing your purpose. The second thing, and this relates to Bank Australia's purpose, is to be authentic. So Bank Australia we changed our name in 2015, and then in 2016 we really started to think about how do we tell our story and how do we raise awareness about what we're trying to do and how we're trying to do things differently. And we articulate our purpose as being in the business of creating mutual prosperity, which is about the economic benefit of our customers, but it's also about creating positive social and environmental change. And we spent a long time coming up with these two sentences that you can see on the screen, because it was a difficult thing to try and articulate exactly what makes us different and why we're here. But we also wanted to try and develop words and language that reflected who we are and sounded a little bit different to the other banks. So this is what we call in our business the elevator pitch. And we've all of our staff, when they join the bank, learn that this is what we're all about, and this is what they can tell people we're all about. What an elevator pitch tries to be is to really describe your purpose in a way that people can understand and in simple enough terms so that you can then have more detailed conversations with people about it. For us, the statement was the first thing. The second thing that we tried to do to be authentic was to think about which stories do we tell and who appears in our advertisements and who appears on our website. And because we're a customer-owned bank, so our shareholders are our customers. So when they open up a bank account, they also become a shareholder. So we don't have external shareholders who we have to try and pay dividends for. We decided that our customers would be the best possible people to represent who we are and to communicate our stories. So the first customer that I'll introduce you to on the next slide is Gary and Coco. So Gary is a customer of ours from Canberra. He is a person who has vision impairment, and his dog Coco is his, not just his, helps him to navigate the world, but is also his best friend. So for us we decided that to be authentic, it's people like Gary and Coco that need to appear in all our advertisements and who need to, wear our messages for us. We put out an email to a whole lot of customers asking for people to volunteer to be in our advertisements and to be champions of the bank. And in 24 hours, we had 150 people put up their hands, which was just absolute. It was mind-blowing and very, very humbling for us. So Gary and Coco put up their hands. The next person is Lindsay. So Lindsay is someone who is from Melbourne. She is absolutely passionate about the environment. And so when she came to the photo shoot, she chose to wear our message about being a bank that doesn't lend to the fossil fuel industry. And that's the message that she was really proud to wear. And then the third customer is Xavier and his son, Bill and his son Xavier. And Bill is a guy from also from Melbourne, from a bit further out in Melbourne, and he has had his background as refugee migrants. He has a real passion for his community, and he wanted to really stand up for this idea of people before profit. Now, I've sort of introduced you to those three people because I think a lot of banks and a lot of advertising uses people who are the aspirational view of what the company wants you to think or what they want you to try and aspire to. Whereas for us, it was really important that our communications was very, very down to earth and authentic through our customers. We also interviewed them, so a lot of the words that are on our website and things are all of our customers' words. So that was the second thing about really being authentic. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was, and this is, I guess, where we get to that countering the spin doctor view, that when you think about your messaging and you think about how you're going to describe your organisation, you absolutely need to talk about what you can evidence. And there are obviously laws in place that you can't mislead people in advertising, but those, that's a legal thing. There is a fair bit of communication out there where people make claims that are true, but if you really dig beneath the surface, perhaps they're not. And for a bank like us that's really positioning ourselves as a responsible bank, we have to make absolutely sure that anything that we put out in our advertising or anywhere else, that we are 100% sure that this is true. So some of the statements that you can see there are quite bold statements, but the work that we put in behind those statements was extensive, and it took us 3 months to develop this campaign. And the next slide has, I guess, another one of our billboards where you can see a really bold statement. And I guess the point I wanted to make to you here was that if you want to align your values with the communications, you need to be 100% accurate about what you're saying, and you need to have all of the proof behind those things. So, for example, on the next slide, we talk about the bank that carbon offsets every car loan is the bank Australia needs. So we have a whole system in place to make sure that we track every car that we have a loan to. We have a very sophisticated way of tracking all of the carbon emissions of the cars that we finance. And then we have another system in place to buy carbon offsets for every single one of those emissions. So while it seems like a simple statement, there's actually a lot that goes on behind that. The last thing that I wanted to mention with this is our conservation reserve. So we talk a lot about our environmental credibility, and we talk a lot about being an environmental bank. And the Conservation Reserve is a project that we've had for 10 years, where we own almost 1,000 hectares of land in the west of Victoria, and we've spent the last 10 years regenerating some really special habitat for endangered species, including the red-tailed black cockatoo that you can see there, which there are only about 900 left in the world. So when we talk about being an environmental organisation or an environmentally conscious bank, we need to make sure that we have all of that evidence in place. And the Conservation Reserve is one of those things that provides us with a lot of evidence. It also provides us with some amazing stories, and our customers are absolutely, they're so supportive of this project, and we have a whole lot of engagement with them. So that 15 minutes went very quickly, and I could talk about these things for a lot longer, but I guess it's just to recap that knowing who you are and what your purpose is really critical to aligning values with communications. Really thinking about how you can communicate that purpose authentically is really, really important. So from the words to the pictures to the kinds of events that you support, the kinds of partners you have, all of those things are really important. And then the third thing, to really counter that view that communications can be a bit of spin, is that you need to be 100% sure that you have the evidence and the proof for every statement that you make. Thank you. I'd love to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Fiona. As Fiona said, we have the opportunity for students to ask questions. I'll read out the ones that have come through already, but if you have any additional questions, please submit them using the chat function in the control panel to the right of your screen. Fiona, just start off with, is it tempting to, working for such a organisation that is doing such great work, is it tempting to not reveal all information when things aren't going too well?
That is an excellent question, and it can be tempting because you have built up a really, you've built your reputation on a particular thing. But we've certainly learned that transparency is an absolutely key ingredient in maintaining a reputation. It can be tempting to think that you could, get away with something, but in the end, you just really can't. And I'm trying to think of an example that I can share. Actually, we discovered a couple of years ago that the methodology that we'd been using to calculate and offset the emissions from the car loans that I talked about was out of date, and it hadn't been reviewed for a few years, and so the figures that we'd been reporting and the carbon offsets that we had been buying had actually been falling short. It was really tempting just to say, start, bring in a new methodology and then just start doing it right. But we actually decided that the better thing to do would be to tell everyone that we hadn't been buying all the offsets that we needed, and to put it into our corporate report that we'd now updated everything, and we then invested in some extra carbon offsets to close the gap. And we got such great feedback from that, and people were really appreciated us being honest about how we'd sort of fallen short.
Is it hard to meet those demands or those expectations? Because buying back land, I can imagine, is pretty expensive. How do you balance that if the bank goes through a rough patch?
That is definitely, we are always needing to balance those things out. And if the bank, so thankfully we haven't had a situation where, those kinds of investments like the Conservation Reserve have come under question. But I think the thing is that the customers and the board and everybody value that project in particular as an asset that is just as worth having as some of our other parts of the business, some of the more traditional kind of banking parts. So it would be, we'd have to be in a really difficult situation for us, for example, to sell that. I guess the other thing that we have done during the good times is with that land, we've put covenants on that land so that even if we had to sell it, or we didn't want to own it anymore, it's protected in perpetuity. So whoever we sold it to would not be able to develop it. So in that way, we would, I guess, protect the legacy of what we've done.
Is there a market out there for businesses that have a social goal, or can businesses just rely on social engagement or community engagement?
Could you repeat the first part of that question, Sam?
Yeah. Is there a market out there for companies that have a social goal, or do they just need to have social engagement?
Look, all of the research that we see is showing that consumers firstly, the consumers are expecting business not just to be there to make money, and particularly younger generations are saying that they are they're thinking about where they spend their money with a lot more thought than perhaps previous generations. And they're wanting to support businesses that are actually going beyond their core business to have a positive impact. We have done a lot of work on trying to understand people who care about social and environmental things, and we've spent a fair bit of time trying to find them in the community. And we estimate, with the help of Roy Morgan, who do a lot of this sort of research, that there are approximately about 8 million Australians who are what we call, or who fall into this group of socially aware people. It's probably a subset of those, probably about 4.5 million, who are starting to make purchasing decisions based on whether companies are genuinely doing good things for the community and for the planet. So I would say that there is definitely a market and a growing awareness of the role that business needs to play in, social and environmental work.
Another question came in saying, can a business change their purpose over time, or does the one that they start with have to remain the same?
Look, I think a business needs to continually think about whether their purpose is still meeting, I guess, the original kind of goals. Society changes a lot, and businesses with a social goal need to be able to adjust it. I would say, though, that perhaps values need to stay the same. So if you have values of honesty or integrity or, positive impact, those sorts of things, I guess, need to remain as core. But how you actually enact that purpose can change over time. So, for example, our bank it's come out of the credit union movement. So after the Second World War, credit unions played a really important role in helping people on low incomes to access finance for things like fridges and those kinds of things, because the major banks wouldn't lend to people who didn't have very high incomes. So that was a social need at the time, whereas now, obviously, people can get loans for all kinds of things very easily. So while we might have that same care for the community, we now think about it in terms of acting on climate change and trying to encourage reconciliation with Indigenous Australians, for example.
Have you had any kickback from those purposes of not lending to companies that do fossil fuel, for example?
Look, we certainly hear from people who don't agree with our position. Not everybody believes that we shouldn't be investing in fossil fuels. Having said that, we ask our customers every couple of years which issues they are really passionate about, and acting on climate change and supporting a transition to a cleaner energy mix for the country has been the number one issue. So While obviously not everyone agrees with us, we know that our customers do support that. Obviously, we don't. It does mean that we don't. We may knock back business sometimes. So from a commercial point of view, sometimes we might not get all of that advantage, but at the same time, because of our purpose, it's not business that we want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Have you had any problems with the established banking structure, so to speak, in setting up Bank Australia?
Well, we've actually been around for 60 years, so we haven't had, I guess, problems in establishing ourselves. I guess it's, and we actually do collaborate and talk to the major banks on a range of issues. It's not like, you know, we're not we're not on speaking terms or that we have resistance from them. But we do things very differently, and they don't always understand, I guess, where we're coming from.
Another student has asked, what's the difference between a credit union and a bank?
Oh, that's a really good question. So a credit union is a financial institution that people have come together and formed themselves. And they started in 18th century in Germany, actually. But they're basically groups of people coming together, putting their money together and letting other people borrow from them. A bank is not too dissimilar. In fact, we are now a customer-owned bank, which is essentially the same as a credit union, but we've just been able to call ourselves a bank. So these days, it's actually just a bit of a technical difference in terms of the kind of license that the regulator gives you. So they're still credit unions, but they operate pretty much the same as us. We've just been able to call ourselves a customer-owned bank. So we still have that cooperative ownership, just like the credit unions.
Has the rebranding allowed you to focus or reset your purpose, or did you have that before becoming Bank Australia?
We had the purpose before becoming Bank Australia, but the renaming to Bank Australia was also an opportunity to think about how we talk about that purpose, and it has given us a lot more focus on being clear about our messaging, and we've done a lot of work since becoming Bank Australia to come up with like that statement I showed you, but all of the messages that are much bolder and much more direct than what we used to use before.
I think the final question for this webinar comes through asking, is it really important to spend as much time as you did on developing the statements and the purpose? As you mentioned, it took a few months.
I would say absolutely, because once you have your story of why you exist and who you are and the things that make you different from your competitors or from other organisations doing the same thing, once you have that right, everything else flows from that and things become a lot more easily, and then you can actually do things a lot more quickly. But if you spend the time up front getting your purpose right, testing it with people who you want to either buy your product or engage in your service or to support you, and really understanding where they're coming from and how the words you're using, what they mean to people. If you do that up front, then you're in a much better position to go forward and then really roll out your stories and be a bit more agile about the way you do things. So yes, I would say so.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, Fiona, for sharing your insight and your knowledge and to be able to uphold our values. We will be able to facilitate further questions on our discussion board. To do so, please log into the Big Idea website for access. Our next webinar will be on Thursday, the 9th of August at 12 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time. and will feature Karina Jenkin, the Education Enterprise Manager at The Big Issue, talking about Business Planning 101. Remember to register for your involvement at thebigidea.org.au. We look forward to your participation in webinars again, and once more, thank you very much, Fiona, for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.